All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we focus on helping you out with your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, and your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. And we're doing that through looking at various and great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, cosmologies, and then also magnum opuses and tour de forces and earth-shattering discoveries. And most of them are coming from very obscure sources that you probably haven't heard of and you probably wouldn't know about if you were not watching this channel. We've done about 300 videos on the ancient Egyptian tree of life, and almost 600 videos on the reciprocal system of theory, which is, in my opinion, the greatest theory of everything that's out there, the most complete, the most elegant, and answers the most questions, and it has equations galore, and I feel like it has been predictive, it stood the test of time, has united all the different forms of science, all the different fields of science, and also has united science and religion. He did make a few mistakes, I think, but I believe that he admitted that he was apt to do that, that you can make a mistake, but the theory itself is correct. My application of the theory is not always correct. So I think people can, and people have, gone and corrected his work in major areas. He's been dead since 1990, so that is up and coming, and I believe that will definitely be the theory of the future. And now we are on a unit that's called the Reciprocal Church, named really in honor of Mr. Larson and his reciprocal system. But what we're doing is we're amassing a lot of sources that have a spiritual aspect to them, things that have numinosity, things that will help you to get closer to your higher self, however you define that, that you can have reverence for. And we've done a lot of different things, different sources in this unit, and we will do many more. But the reason why we do this is because we feel like all of the Western religions are moribund, and they are about to all be exposed for being fraudulent in one way or another. And that includes Christianity, Judaism, Islam, also Satanism, and atheism or scientism. And as far as the New Age movement goes, I think there's a core of truth there, and there's just a whole lot of marketing and advertising around it that is also, ultimately turning it into a fraud. But as far as Christianity is concerned, that's what we're working with here, the New Testament decode. And this also includes Satanism, because Satanism is really like the evil twin of Christianity. They both come out of the New Testament. There really isn't a kind of supernatural Satan in the Old Testament. There's kind of the word Satan is used a handful of times, but in each case it's really like a human that they're referring to, an obstacle or an adversary, an impediment. One time the name Satan is actually used to describe King David. So that doesn't count. What we're talking about is the Satanism. Satan and Satanism was a fiction, just like Jesus is a fiction. Because we have done the deep dive, and we recognize that the obvious truth that the New Testament was written by the Roman Caesars from the 1st century. In particular, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian, Titus, his son, and his other son Domitian. They ruled the Roman Empire from 69 to 96 AD, and they wanted to mellow out the Jews. The Jews were being a big thorn in the side of the Romans. In their empire, they governed hundreds of nations, but the Jews were the hardest to to keep under control. They were always having revolts and even wars. Really, it was kind of like 100-year-long or even over 100-year-long kind of intermittent warfare going on. And Titus and Vespasian were both military generals in the major war between the Jews and the Romans between 66 and 73 AD. They were both wounded in that war, and so they decided that they were going to create and I'm not just talking about them, their lackeys and their relatives and everybody else that was living at Caesar's palace, and that was part of the group there, the elite Roman royals. And they decided to really kind of prune the tree of the root of the Jews and try to kind of neutralize it or domesticate it by the Jews were waiting from the New Testament for a savior, but the savior that they envisioned was a military general who was going to lead them to defeat the Romans. Some of those characters did emerge in the 1st century, but what the Romans wanted to do is they wanted to propose the savior who was a prince of peace and who believed in turning the other cheek to oppression, who believed that the Roman slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Judea, who wanted to walk an extra mile with the Roman soldier's pack on his back, and who wanted to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And so they came up with this, it was called Ur Marcus, which I think is known as Q, the Q document. That was the first prototype, maybe around 60 or a little later AD. But what they did is they backdated all of the events and inserted a few actual historical characters like Herod Antipas and Gamaliel, the Jewish leader, and a few others. But all of the characters that were related to Jesus were all actually members of the author's family. If the author was this guy Arius Piso, who was kind of like the shadow emperor of Vespasian and Titus and a close relative, I believe his family was kind of put in charge of writing this new universal, the other term for universal is Catholic religion. And his father took it up, but they presented it to Emperor Nero at some point, and Nero didn't go for it. And so they plotted to assassinate Nero, and they got found out, and Nero executed both Seneca the Younger, and Lucius Piso, the father of Arius Piso, in 65 AD. And so from there, his son Arius took over the project, and he took on a number of different pseudonyms. He doesn't really even show up in the historical record. He went from one pseudonym to another, but for this time period, he was going once the War of the Jews started, or once Vespasian took the throne, then he became this guy named Josephus. And Josephus is well known by Christians as the only source outside of the New Testament to actually corroborate the existence of Jesus. And unfortunately, that doesn't really help when you recognize that Josephus was, even by his own autobiography, was a member of the Roman royal family, albeit adopted, and lived at Caesar's palace as the court historian. And so, you know, he's absolutely not to be trusted, even though Western civilization really thinks that he is one of the great historians of all time, if not the greatest historian of all time. But he wrote this book that was called War of the Jews, or Jewish War. And then he backdated the Gospels by 40 years and talked about Jesus from 40 years before. A lot of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are actually fulfilled by Titus, the military commander and future emperor in War of the Jews. But there's more than that. There are literally thousands of parallels between the two books when read kind of side by side. Sometimes Josephus parodies the New Testament, and sometimes the New Testament parodies Jesus, or parodies Josephus, and they kind of are in conversation with one another. They work kind of hand in hand, and we are looking at a book from Michael Menescot's that just came out about 6 months ago called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And what he does is he takes the book of Luke, the third gospel, and he puts it on the vertical axis of a graph. Chapter 1 at the bottom and chapter 24 at the top, 1 through 24. And then he takes Jewish War by Josephus and he puts it on the horizontal axis. Paragraph 1 on the left-hand side, paragraph 694 on the right-hand side. And every time he spots a parallel or a correspondence, a riddle, some kind of connection, then he plots a point there. And you would think that that would create a lot of noise and give you a random pattern. But in fact, what it does is it gives you 5 nearly perfect Latin letters, A, P, T, V, S, possibly US. And I believe that stands for Arius, Piso, Titus, Vespasian. I'm not sure about the S. But the basic idea is that the Roman Caesars actually signed their name to the New Testament, in particular the book of Luke. And so Menescot's painstakingly goes over these parallels in this book one at a time. He found 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. And by the way, I'm sorry about yesterday. The camera cut off early and I didn't have enough time to re-record anything. So we didn't get too far yesterday, but we're going to get into this right now. So this is Jewish War by Josephus, paragraphs 522 to 524, and it's book 4, chapter 10, paragraphs 3 through 5. If we estimate the capacity of governing by age, we should choose Vespasian. Again, Vespasian was the general who eventually became emperor, and he adopted Josephus. According to Josephus, he adopted Josephus, who was one of the Jewish generals, and he defected. And Vespasian he gave Vespasian the prophecy that Vespasian would one day become emperor. And when Vespasian did become emperor, he pardoned Josephus and took him to Rome, adopted him into his family, and gave him a townhouse at the palace. So here we go. So this is part of the decision-making process for becoming the emperor. That's kind of what he's talking about here. If we estimate the capacity of governing by age, we should choose Vespasian. Or if by the strength of a young man, Titus. Titus is his son. When Vespasian went to Rome to be the emperor, he appointed Titus as the military commander for the siege of Jerusalem. So Vespasian, the old man, agreed to be Caesar and decided to gain dominion over Alexandria, which was the second biggest city in the empire, Alexandria, Egypt. So over Alexandria, as it would help him obtain the government, since it supplied the corn to Rome, and in this way he hoped to dethrone Vitellius. Vitellius was the emperor that basically was assassinated right before Vespasian became emperor. Okay, so that little passage there is paralleled by Luke 5, chapter 5, verse 39, and also chapter 6, verse 1. No man, also having drunk old wine, straightway desires new, for he says, the old is better. And on the second Sabbath, after the first, Jesus went through the cornfields, and his disciples plucked the ears of corn and did eat, rubbing them in their hands. Okay, so we see the parallels of old is better and corn, and basically taking custody of the corn, or went through the cornfields and his disciples plucked the ears of corn. Okay, his analysis. I mentioned before that Jewish war earlier described Vespasian being chosen due to being an old man, and these paragraphs in Josephus reference that idea that old was preferable and immediately describe him as having to detour to take control of the empire's corn supplies. So to detour to Alexandria on his way to Rome to take control of the empire's corn supplies, thereby putting himself in a strategic position for others to acknowledge him as emperor, which Luke subtly parodies. Having described this reverse order sequence of parallels, I now plot their locations, showing that it constructs a downward diagonal line forming the left-hand side of the V of the APTVS pattern. Now, so the right-hand side we've already gone over, because the right-hand side is where both events from both books are in order. As you move further through one book, you're also moving further through the other, and that's where the parallels are. The left-hand side of the V is as you move through War of the Jews, you move backwards in Luke. So that's a little bit harder to find, but that's the left-hand side of the V. So he graphs that out and shows it here. I don't have really, only on the thumbnail, I put the overall graph of the whole thing. So if you look at the thumbnail, you'll see all 250 points plotted. But he kind of periodically updates the chart as he goes along. So with most of the V being more clearly visible, I will now move on to another group that are mainly located in the S. Okay, so let's turn the page here and start getting into the S. Okay. Okay, so this section is called Jewish War Parodying Luke, Helping Complete the S. So these sections of parallels we'll be having Josephus parodying the Gospels. Now again, there's plenty of parallels that go the other way, so you can't really say that one was written after the other. You know, by just looking at these, you can be tempted to say, oh, Josephus is just writing after Jesus and you know, filling it in. The first thing that's wrong with that is that Josephus is supposed to be, according to scholars, is writing a history. So he's bound by, you know, certain true facts that occurred in this war, so-called, if you believe all that. But the second part of it is that there are plenty of parallels where the Gospels is actually parodying Josephus, meaning that they were written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. And this was a Roman pastime that many of them enjoyed. It was kind of like a little game to see if they could decipher the riddles, and all of the, actually a ton of pornographic jokes and mockeries and mean-spiritedness of the Jews and anybody who believes this, so that nowadays the Christians as well. In particular, they make fun of, mock the Jews for their cannibalism, and they spread it over to the rest of the hoi polloi, the Gentiles. But that's mainly in the Pauline epistles. The Gospels are mainly targeted toward the Jews, in my opinion. Okay, so far the majority of the parallels involved Luke parodying Jewish war. Hopefully by now the reader has appreciated that although it is possible to err when assessing any individual parallel, there is clearly a huge volume of material where Jesus' story acts as a parody or parable of the Flavian invasion set out in Jewish war. I now turn to a sequence of parallels in which, for the most part, it is clear that Jewish war is parodying Luke right back. It is important to appreciate these mutual parodies, and that is one of the main pieces of evidence that the stories were written together. The logical argument is quite simple. If the two stories had been created separately, it would only be possible for the later one to parody the early one. But if they have mutual parodies, again, they're written at the same time. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned today is we talked about the motive, and this is right down the wheelhouse of the MO of the Romans as well. They created a number of other religions for political purposes, but they also they are the only people who had the opportunity, the means, and the resources to do this. The New Testament and Josephus are both written in Greek. There was hardly anybody in Palestine, in Judea, who spoke Greek, much less wrote in it. Only the high elite, like the Herod family and so on. Whereas in Rome, it was kind of more of a commoner's language, whereas Latin was the elite language. And they had a complete monopoly over publishing, and they also had a complete monopoly over dissemination. And so it's kind of when you consider the Roman hypothesis for the Gospels, it becomes pretty obvious that this is true, because nobody else could have possibly done it. And the only way that you can even consider that the Jews would have done it, in Palestine, is that there is no other way that it could have happened. But then when you recognize the Roman hypothesis, you realize that there actually is another way. And it points to a conspiracy, a fraud, a psychological operation, and a piece of wartime propaganda that might, grate you or whatever if you have problems with conspiracy theories. but it's a hell of a lot better of a theory than, you know, God did it, and that, you know, the resort to supernatural explanations to explain things that could be easily explained without them. Okay, another way to explain it is that if you want one story to be a detailed parody of the other, you must have editorial control of the one that will be the parody. Therefore, if you want two stories to parody each other, you must have editorial control over both. The fact that all these parallels are arranged to present a great big message when the locations are plotted helps ensure that this cannot be explained away as both documents parodying some earlier story, since even if they were, the careful placement of parallels in both stories still demonstrates that a single governing hand had simultaneous editorial control over both Jewish War and Luke. With that, I will now describe the next sequence of parallels, which mostly form the S, or sometimes the top of the V. Okay, let's see. It's so hard to see how much time I have here, how we're doing time-wise. That's probably because I hope my... that's why I'm trying to raise some money to get some professional equipment and so on, and get some marketing for this, so I can get my algorithm together so that some people actually start to watch these videos, because I literally am holding my phone in place with a rubber band. So, okay, this is Jewish War 539. Unfortunately, he doesn't say where that is, but it's either book 4 or book 5, late book 4, early book 5. Titus is described riding outside Jerusalem with neither his headpiece or breastplate on, and escapes despite attempts of the Jews to kill him. Okay, if he had described this passage a little bit more detail, Titus is in Jerusalem, but he kind of went out sightseeing, and so he doesn't have his armor on, and you know, the kind of symbolic idea there is that he's naked, so because he doesn't have his armor on. So this is paralleled with Luke 22. Verse 50, and there's a related passage in Mark 14, verse 49, and he says, Mark and Luke describe that the servant cut off the high priest's ear. I thought that was okay. Mark and Luke, I thought that was Peter. Mark and Luke describe that the servant cut off the high priest's ear, and Mark adds a random story of an unnamed man at Jerusalem, unclothed, quote, unclothed, barring a cloth, who escaped despite attempts by the Jews to seize him. This is clearly an odd thing to interject into a pivotal part of Jesus' story. And that is a trigger for you to be looking for a parallel, is whenever either Jesus or the Gospels kind of makes an offhand comment or a non sequitur where it's kind of like they're in the middle of a dramatic sequence, but then they make a couple sentences that don't really fit into the rest of the text. That's where the parallels are. So if you want to try to dig some of those out, that's what you look for. Okay, so he says, this is another example of a parallel that Joseph Atwill described in his book, Caesar's Messiah, which is a great book that came out in 2005 and kind of introduced this topic to the 21st century. It had been written about sporadically during the 20th century, and even in the 19th century, some scholars have figured out that the Romans wrote the Gospels, but you know, the church kind of suppressed it all because the people that belong to the Roman Catholic Church are still the relatives of the Piso family. All of the like the first 30 popes are direct descendants of the Piso family. Okay, examples like this, along with the cannibal Mary, which we'll see later, comes from Josephus, and it matches up with something that is in, I guess it's in Luke, but it's where where Lazarus, where they have dinner with at Lazarus's, and Mary is like choosing the good portion. Okay, examples like this, along with the cannibal Mary story, show that Atwill had discovered examples where Jewish war parodies Luke. If he had found many more examples, I think he might have taken the next logical step, identifying that a pair of stories that mutually parody each other's core narratives in intense detail can only have been written as a single literary project, thereby showing that Luke also originates from the Roman government. I think Atwill did take that logical step, so I'm not sure where he's going with that. Maybe not to the detail that he has, but I think that definitely Atwill figured out that the Romans wrote the Gospels. Curiously, it could be argued that the parallel above also evokes the story in Genesis, where a Joseph escapes an amorous woman by leaving his robe behind. Interesting. Whilst it might be tempting to leap from such observations, to argue that all these parallels can be explained away by both stories parodying the same group of pre-existing but mostly non-surviving stories, there are some real difficulties with that approach. Firstly, you'd have to imagine Titus published a fictional account of his record of his victories so that it would intensely evoke such non-surviving stories for no identifiable reason. Secondly, you'd have to imagine that Jesus' story is similarly a parody of mainly non-surviving stories, again for no identifiable reason. Thirdly, if the reader scrutinizes the parallels throughout this book, they clearly are mostly parodying each other, and this is merely one of the small number of exceptions where you could argue about it. And fourthly, all the parallels are arranged to form the letters APTVS when plotted, so even if both Luke and Jewish War were parodying some group of earlier documents, making this pattern appear still required having editorial control over both documents, which still forces the conclusion that Luke has the same origin as the Flavian government's war propaganda. Okay, let's see if we can squeeze in another parallel here. Jewish War 540, Book 5, paragraph